We're going to be reading from Psalm 136 in the New Living Translation. Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to the God of gods.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to the Lord of lords.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who alone does mighty miracles.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who made the heavens so skillfully.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who placed the earth among the waters.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who made the heavenly lights.
His faithful love endures forever.
The sun to rule the day.
His faithful love endures forever.
And the moon and the stars to rule the night.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who killed the firstborn of Egypt.
His faithful love endures forever.
He brought Israel out of Egypt.
His faithful love endures forever.
He acted with a strong hand and powerful arm.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who parted the Red Sea.
His faithful love endures forever. He led Israel safely through.
His faithful love endures forever.
But he hurled Pharaoh and his army into the Red Sea.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who led His people through the wilderness.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to Him who struck down mighty kings.
His faithful love endures forever.
He killed powerful kings.
His faithful love endures forever.
Sihon, king of the Amorites.
His faithful love endures forever.
And Og, king of Bashan.
His faithful love endures forever.
God gave the land of these kings as an inheritance.
His faithful love endures forever.
A special possession to His servant Israel.
His faithful love endures forever.
He remembered us in our weakness.
His faithful love endures forever.
He saved us from our enemies.
His faithful love endures forever.
He gives food to every living thing.
His faithful love endures forever.
Give thanks to the God of heaven.
His faithful love endures forever.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
His love endures forever. 4 words, 26 times in 26 verses. I wonder if this is an ancient Hebrew version of a praise song. You know what they say about praise songs, just 7 words, 11 times over and over again. Some people critique contemporary praise choruses for their banal repetition, and yet here we are in Psalm 136, 4 words, 26 times. It was sort of exhausting to read it all in one sitting, huh? When we were planning this service, we toyed with the idea of breaking that reading up into parts to make it a little more palatable for the ear. But we decided against it because we wanted us to feel it in its entirety today and say it again and again, even if what we were feeling felt like memorized monotony. His love endures forever. I think that's why people are sort of repulsed by repetitive refrains. We don't like to say the same things over and over and over again because we're just saying the same things over and over and over again. It feels like memorization, which we all know to be one of the lowest forms of human learning. Rote recitation is not the same as true learning. We all know that. You can memorize all the U.S. presidents in chronological order, but that doesn't mean you have any knowledge whatsoever about what any of them did or who they really were. Memorizing a thing doesn't mean you understand what you're saying. It doesn't mean you comprehend what you're saying. It doesn't even mean that you mean what you're saying. You can say it with your eyes closed. You can say it with your heart closed. His love endures forever. It sounds like a responsive reading the ancient Hebrews were just reciting. It's just memorization. Last May, New York Magazine ran a story on John Basinger, who was recently retired from teaching theater at a local community college. Basinger's claim to fame was that he had memorized over the course of 8 years the entirety of John Milton's Paradise Lost. That work is 60,000 words, detailing wars between angels and exploring the nature of human sins. It's the equivalent of a 350-page novel, and he memorized it. He recited it on 2 separate occasions, and each time it took him 3 days to recite the story. Can you imagine memorizing something that took 3 days to recite? A Wesleyan University psychologist brought Basinger in to study his brain and to study how he memorized so much so well. And the psychologist came to the conclusion that the key to Basinger's remembering was what he called deep encoding. Now listen closely, I know you're interested in this. They noticed that when Basinger recited the poem, he was discernibly expressive. He said it with feeling. He's an actor, remember? He hadn't just memorized the words, he had felt them. He hadn't just memorized the letters strung together, he had memorized what those words meant. He had coupled hours and hours and hours of repetition with a deep conceptual understanding of the poem, which allowed him to contain the whole story in his mind. 350 pages, it took him 3 days. He even said that he imagined the poem spatially as a great cathedral in which he could explore and play and visit particular rooms anytime he wanted. Which is something very similar to what they learned about Alex Mullen, who is a med student at Ole Miss, but also the reigning world memory champion. Mullen can memorize a deck of cards, any deck of cards, the order of an entire deck of cards in just a few seconds. In fact, last year he set the world record memorizing the order of a deck of cards in 17 seconds. And yet, he says it's not beyond him to forget where he put his keys. Made me feel better. Last year, a group of neuroscientists decided to study the brains of Mullen and 23 others like him. They called them memory athletes. And they decided to study their brains and compare them with the brains of normal folk, like you and me, I would guess. Much to their surprise, when they compared them, there was no discernible difference between the brains. They expected to find that the memories athletes' brains contained a larger hippocampus, which is the part of the brain they believed to control one's memory. But what they discovered was no difference in the size of the brain, no difference in the structure of the brain, but they did discover a difference in the connectedness of the brain systems. The memory athletes found a way to visualize the data, which exercised more than one part of their brain. It's why memory is so very closely tied to our senses. You know how it is, you smell a smell, you hear a song, you feel a texture, a taste, a sight, and immediately, boom, you're transported to another time and place. Our senses are intricately interrelated with memory, and we smell something, we hear something, and the different systems in our brain call to mind something we've previously lived through. Mullen said that he used a memory technique he called memory palace, in which he envisioned the material like a palace, and recalling it was simply walking around inside the palace. It's interesting, isn't it, that both John Basinger and Alex Mullen used spatial concepts to memorize their material, and so they weren't just reciting from rote memory, they experienced the material. There was an affective component in how they memorized it. I've gotten to the place in my life where I have a growing rather than diminishing appreciation for memory. Probably because memory is becoming more difficult for me to come by these days. I know I know that memorization is one of the lowest forms of human learning. We all know that. That's true. And I, for one, have spent a great deal of time as a pastor working with people who had committed Scripture to memory but didn't understand it. They knew nothing about what it meant in its original context or what it would have us do in our context. They had learned what it said but never struggled with what it meant. And I'm not sure of the benefit of knowing what it says if we don't wrestle with what it means. And come to think of it, I don't know that I have ever asked one congregant of mine to memorize one Bible verse. I'm sort of ashamed by that. I don't think I've ever asked anyone in my churches to memorize a Bible verse. But all the while I've sort of been degrading memorization, I can't escape it either. And neither can you. Comprehending a field of knowledge, any field of knowledge, is based on some degree of memorization. Before you can comprehend literature, you have to be able to read. And before you can read, you have to know the alphabet. I bet I know how you learned your alphabet. You sang it until you memorized it. Before you can work an algebra problem, you have to memorize the multiplication table. Before you can translate a language, you have to memorize the declensions of verbs. When I was a freshman in college, I took Greek 1. One of the first few weeks of class, our professor made us memorize the verb endings to a monastic chant. All of us Greek students were walking around campus chanting, Oese Amenediusi. And to this day, I don't know why people looked at us as if we were weird. To be sure, memorization is not the highest form of learning. It's not where learning ends. I don't know anybody who believes that. But in some ways, memorization is the beginning of learning. It's the foundation upon which our learning is based. And if that's the case, then Psalm 136 is a pretty good place to start. If you take out the refrain, His love endures forever, what's left is a great deal of Israel's story. The psalm begins with God the Creator organizing the heavens and spreading the earth. He made the lights great and small. And then the psalm turns towards the Exodus and this God who subverted the Egyptian empire and the Pharaoh who thought the world ran through power over people rather than the power of love between them. This was the God who overturned the powers of Egypt even when they were found outside of Egypt. This was the God whose heart was always turned towards the least of these, the vulnerable. This is the God who in the muck and the mire of history sees and rescues and provides. This psalm tells the story of creation and Exodus. It tells much of Israel's story, but interspersed throughout the story is this worshipful line, His love endures forever. To live in creation with your eyes open at all is to recognize the love of God. To behold a sunrise or a sunset for what it is. To see a tree afire with red and yellow. To watch a seed sprout from the ground is to see something of the love of God, if you read this psalm well. And God's hand in history isn't a hand of control and power and force as much as it is a hand of love. This psalm seems to be saying that the lens through which we make sense of God's activity, God's hand in the heavens, and God's activity in the political arenas of this world, God's hand only makes sense when it's seen through the lens of His love endures forever. Now, your Bible might say it differently. Some translations say mercy, some say loving kindness, some say faithfulness. None of those translations are wrong, but all of them are missing something. The Hebrew word for love in His love endures forever is hesed. It's an umbrella concept to which there is no adequate English equivalent. It's love to be sure, but it's covenant love. It's love with a spine. It's love that said yes to something and is devoted to that something. It's love with some stick-to-itiveness and stubbornness about it. It's love with grit, love with fire, love with perseverance. A few years ago, I was driving around with my boys in tow, who were very young at the time, and we would play this game, I love you too, so-and-so and back. I love you all the way to so-and-so. They were little. I would say, I love you all the way to Arkansas. We lived in Oklahoma City at the time. Arkansas was a long way away. We used this to teach geography, you know. I love you all the way to Arkansas. Well, I love you all the way to Arkansas and back. I love you all the way to Mexico. I love you all the way to Mexico and back. I love you all the way to the moon. One day, my oldest son, I think, was tired of playing this game. And he said to me, Dad, I just love you again and again and again and again and again. I know your stomach's turned at the sappiness of all that. I know that. But I think he got it. It wasn't the sappiness and the distance that Hesed is about. It's the perseverance of the thing. Again and again and again and again. It's the love that spouses pledge to each other at the altar before they really know what they're getting into. It's the love of parents for children and the love of lifelong friends who have been friends all life long. It's love that says yes again and again and again when the alarm goes off at 5:30 in the morning, when the dishes have yet to be washed, when the other is in need, again and again and again. And it is the love of God for each and every single one of us. Brothers and sisters, God's love is eternal, but it is also daily. God's love is heavenly and stratospheric and wondrous, but it is also routine and mundane and habitual. It manifests itself in the bread of life, but it also comes to us in daily bread. He loves us again and again and again and again and again and again. His love endures forever. Alice Saunders grew up in an idyllic home in New Hampshire with her father, Arpy, who taught her how to fish and catch salamanders and frogs and tadpoles on their family farm. Growing up every Thursday night, Arpy and Alice had a father-daughter dinner date, and all was well with the world in all of her growing up years. Until just before Alice moved off to college, she noticed some speech issues with her dad. He confused words and oftentimes couldn't find the right word. And he was diagnosed with FTD, or frontotemporal dementia, a very specific form of dementia which impacts one's speech primarily. It's degenerative and terminal. And so the doctor informed them that Arpy's speech would grow worse over the next 5 to 10 years and he would eventually pass away. And that is what happened. Arpy knew what he wanted to say in his mind. He just couldn't say it. And so, as his vocabulary shrank, he simply began to repeat the phrases that were important to him over and over and over again until only one phrase was left in his vocabulary. 3 words. I love you. Over and over and over and over again, he said those 3 words. Near the end, an entire phone conversation between the two would be, I love you, for 5 minutes. And because he repeated these words over and over and over and over again, he held on to those words to the very end. And even beyond. A few months after his death, Alice's husband gave her a thumb drive which had the recordings of all the voicemails in which he had called her and she had not answered, and yet he had just repeated thousands of times, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you, I love you. She says she plans to play that recording for her kids so that her dad's words will outlive him. Life took all that man's words, but it didn't take those words. And it couldn't take those words because he said them again and again and again. A few years ago, I was having coffee on a Monday morning with an Episcopal rector from up the street. He said, well, a Baptist visited worship yesterday. I said, oh boy. She was walking out, confessed to being a Baptist, and she said, so do y'all say the same things every Sunday? He said, yes. She said, you say the Lord's Prayer every Sunday? He said, yes, we say it every Sunday. She said, see, you've turned it into a tradition. You say it every week and you don't even have to think about it. And he said, well, ma'am, that's why we say it every week. So that we don't even have to think about it. We even want our reflexes to be holy. Brothers and sisters, that's why we repeat things over and over and over again in the Lord's house, so that we don't even have to think about them. Because life has a way of taking away our words. We repeat them because life has a way of taking away our words. And sooner or later, live long enough, you'll suffer to the point and hurt to the point and be confused to the point and angry to the point and blindsided to the point and doubt to the point that you run out of words, and all you'll be left with are the things you've said over and over and over and over again. You'll remember when that day comes. You'll remember, but you'll only remember in ways that are more transformative than rational recall. You'll remember, but only the things that you know at levels deeper than your knowing. You'll remember, but only the things that you can find in your palace of memory. Israel had one, a palace of memory. You can see it in this psalm. Times when they said, do you remember the time when God? Yeah, I remember that. And do you remember the time when God? And do you remember the time? Yeah. And they built a palace of memory. I bet if you and I put our brains together today, I bet if we came together and thought long enough and hard enough, we could build a palace of memory in this room today. Do you remember the time when God? Well, do you? Think. Do you remember the time? And so, though Egypt is still very much with us, and though we do not lack for pharaohs today, His love endures forever. Though our bodies are broken and frail, and though sickness and disease are amongst us, His love endures forever. It'd be all right with me if y'all help me with this. Though death is still a part of our lives and the lives of those we love, His love endures forever. Though cycles of oppression and shadowy systems still shape our world, His love endures forever. Though might too often makes right and power too often corrupts, His love endures forever. Though we succeed in our efforts or fail, His love endures forever. And though we are praised by people or mocked, His love endures forever. And when our love has grown weak and we have run out of words, His love endures forever. Hang on to those words, brothers and sisters. Cling to them. Let them cling to you. Say them until they get in your bones and sinews, into your neurons and synapses, into your eyes and your ears. Say them 26 times or 26,000. Say them until they are the unquestioned assumption on which you have built your life. Say them until they are the memorized foundation on which all your lifelong learning is built, on which all your learning stands. His love endures forever. You may need those 4 words this week. At some point, those 4 words may be all you have. They may be all you ever need.